Appreciate you guys being on. I guess first thing I want to talk about, obviously we're going to be discussing the mental training course that we all work together to design and produce. Um, my first question is like what is the general problem we were trying to solve? Like maybe we can discuss like why did we make this course in the first place?
I think that there is an understanding that the mental side of the game is extremely important. And most coaches believe so, probably most players, but it's not addressed. And there's probably not a framework that's easy to use to educate coaches and players, and then to implement where they can actually see results.
I think that's so true. And for me it was also just recognizing we've spent so much time, energy, resources creating systems around building velocity, building the physical capabilities, building arsenals, the data, the pitch design. And our coaches will discuss the mental side like on individual calls, things like that, but we didn't have it really addressed in any formal capacity. And realizing like, hey, it's not just about improving our arsenals like in a practice setting. It's about how do these arsenals actually play and perform in a true game setting. And so, you can run models and see like how this arsenal in theory, like in a vacuum would perform. The problem is that like there's more going on than just like this arsenal playing in a vacuum. Can this guy actually go and execute this arsenal to locations under pressure, game on the line? Um, and that's an intangible that's pretty tough to measure and model out. But again, we recognize how important that is. We didn't have a formal process in place for actually educating guys and then, putting systems in place for them to train it. So I think from my standpoint, that's really why we made it a priority this really a year ago at this time when we started these conversations. Guess, do you have a
Yeah, I think
take on
that, I
that?
mean, part of my, like, the incentive or the, kind of the idea was even in grad school, I remember in like learning about these things, like from a program design perspective, you control every variable from like strength and conditioning, and you have like a needs analysis and you figure out like what's the plan. And I just feel like that's so often neglected from the mental side, and especially in pitching. I mean, anybody who's ever thrown knows that like the mound can be an incredibly lonely place. And so the goal to arm athletes with the information to make sure that like when things go wrong, because it's not if, it's when, that you have the mental tools in place to be able to correct that and correct it acutely, immediately, not just let it devolve and like what could be fixed in a week or a month becomes like a whole year yips, and then all of a sudden your career has taken a big step backwards.
Why do you guys think that so many coaches do overlook mental training, knowing its importance, knowing that there is value there? Why is it not trained more? Why is it not a mainstay in more coaches, more athletes programs?
I think there's multiple layers. One of them is time. There's time restrictions at every level except for professional, where they have to, follow rules or lack of facilities. That's one. I think two is understanding what mental skills actually are, how to build them, what can we do to build them. I think three is probably a little bit of fear of the unknown and fear of getting player buy-in. And as a coach, it's really important. I've talked to coaches that have tried the mental skills for a little bit and then it's gone by the wayside. And if you don't make it a priority as a coach, you're not going to get that buy-in from your players. So it's like you have to constantly put that penny in the penny bank every single day to show them that it is important. And especially when you're in an environment like here where you're not at risk of weather, so you can get outside more throughout the year. January, February, March, if you're in the South, you can still get outside. You're trying to utilize every second that you have in college and the high school game, and I think they forget about it.
I would say too. I think probably it's a messy topic. Getting really diving into like the mental side of the game and trying to actually kind of have hard, clear conversations about it. It's just like a difficult topic to like tackle. And in programs, collegiate or professional programs that are so well equipped, most coaches probably just refer out to like if they have some sort of sports psychologist on staff, like just go talk to them, right? And you just kind of like Heisman the athlete and be like that, come back to me like when you're fixed or anything like that. And so here, I think that like the goal was certainly to make sure all coaches at Tread are armed with the information, all athletes are armed to like start that conversation proactively, not refer you out when it becomes a problem reactively. And then the last thing, I think there's a lot of stigma behind the mental game. As a guy who dealt with the yips for some period of my career too, like no athlete wants to admit that they're having doubts. Very few athletes feel comfortable admitting to their coach, like, hey, I'm having some performance psychology issues and confidence problems. Like, what can I do? Because you don't want that to be held against you and like affect your playing time. So again, I think that normally in most team environments, the mental side of the game becomes a problem when it's already too late, right? And so like if you can get ahead of that problem and have these conversations and enhance these mental skills tools before things fall off the rails, that's really the goal, you know?
It's intangible.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point there in that it is intangible. It's hard to measure. It's right. Ever since radar guns were invented, ever since, we have TrackMan, we have Rapsodo, we can really measure everything. And what you measure, you improve, but you also, there can be a tendency to bias training, bias preparation in favor of the things that are more objective that we can measure. And the mental training, again, is, almost by definition, it's intangible. So I think it gets overlooked in large part for that reason. And to your point about the stigma, mental training is not just for athletes that are struggling mentally, right? You can, even if you're not having issues, like you don't maybe have command issues, it doesn't mean that you still can't benefit from having a process, having routines, like having some sort of emphasis placed on, even if it's 5 minutes a day. Like 0 minutes a day is not the right answer. Like we all understand like there's value here. It's just more, it's like bridging the gap between, okay, there's value, but like how do I actually implement a plan to get these guys better? And that's where, again, it can be such a hurdle to do the research, do the homework as a coach, to put together, meditations, to guide your team through a meditation if you've never done it. That I just think there's so many hurdles to making that a reality that it's just the minority of coaches that do that. I wanted to kind of switch and talk a little bit about, our own personal experiences with the mental game and, what initially created that buy-in for each of us. I'm sure we all have stories of like when we initially realized like, okay, this is actually powerful. This is actually impactful. Alex, maybe you can start. Like, what's your story of like first learning a little bit about it and then implementing it in your own career?
Yeah, so I enjoyed success all through high school, and then was fortunate to go play Division I. And freshman year in college, also saw a lot of success relative to kind of that level. And then for me, at least, I'd always heard of the yips, knew it was a thing, but certainly never thought that like I would become a problem. It would become a problem for me. For me, at least, the kind of the way it devolved was slow. It wasn't just like one day you wake up with the yips. It's just like one day you have a bullpen and like things don't go quite right, and then maybe that bullpen turns into like an outing that doesn't go quite well. And it was this slow, progressive process until all of a sudden it's like, man, what am I doing anymore? And then again, the rubber and the mound are an incredibly lonely place. And for me, my performance on the field permeated and affected every aspect of my own personal life too. I wasn't happy. I wasn't enjoying college as much because like I couldn't command the zone as well. And it's silly looking back on it to like think that like your ability to throw a ball like affects everything, but it did. Because at that point in life, like that was who I was, right? Baseball wasn't something that I did. It was who I fundamentally was as a person. And it was a really profound experience. I think that's kind of what inspired me to be a psychology major in undergrad to begin with, was maybe just to learn a little bit more about the process and try to arm myself and stuff. For me, at least, again, I think that going through that experience and knowing that I didn't have the tools really opened my eyes to the fact that like human beings, we identify with any number of things in that given time, whether it be a baseball player or the profession that you have or a student or whatever it is. Like we all tie our identity to something. And if you're not armed with the tools to be able to like manage that in a healthy manner, like it can be a really big problem. For me, at least, once I joined the military, like I talked to a number of Marines who like I was armed with the information and armed with the experience to be able to have tough conversations about like, hey, what's going on under the hood, right? That stigma, very few people I think are willing to proactively seek help, right? Oftentimes it's like a reactive kind of like, oh crap, something just went wrong, and that's when I'm kind of trying to have these conversations. So I made a point out of my own personal athletic career and the struggles that I faced to then try to be proactive and have those tough conversations in a completely different environment in the Marine Corps to make sure Marines who may be dealing with something like those issues are addressed and they're handled. So it was a big, well-rounded experience just to teach me about how important what's going on up here is, because it just affects everything else in life.
So did you primarily learn about it through your major, or did you have a coach in collage?
Never had
teammates?
a coach in
How did you come across it?
I would say, I dug my heels in and I gritted my teeth and I banged my head against the walls, metaphorically speaking, for the better part of a season and a half, maybe 2 years. Certainly didn't have a coach in college who I felt comfortable talking to about this stuff. I was learning about psychology on my own, but it's tough to learn and self-diagnose and self-treat kind of all as a 19-year-old kid on a college campus. So I struggled and certainly probably failed more than I succeeded. And I think that with proper coaching and being armed with the proper tools, I could have shortened what was a season and a half to a 2-year kind of like dip in my career and expedited that and gotten back on track much quicker. By senior year, I'd figured things out a little bit, but by that point, again, development, 2 years worth of development or struggling there, like you pay the price for that, So I think in hindsight, though I was able to kind of figure it out on my own through trial and error, the right tools would have shortened that window significantly.
I think that speaks to a couple things. I think first off, recognizing like any athletes watching this, like you are ultimately responsible for your own career. You have to be your own best coach. Just listening to a podcast with a pitching ninja and Greg Maddux, and he's like, you're probably going to be the best pitching coach you ever have. You might as well like work to
Sure.
learn as much as you can. You know more about yourself than anybody else does. So recognizing like, yeah, even if you don't have a coach that you trust and confide in, which like is extremely valuable, worth their weight in gold, and you should try to find that. But if you don't, still very much take ownership of your career, do whatever you have to do to get the knowledge, get the information, to figure it out yourself. But then from a coach's standpoint, it brings up like it's so important to be able to dig underneath the hood and not just look at like their mechanics, how they're moving on video, the pitch metrics, the velocity, like the lifting metrics. That's all important, but there's so much more that you can understand about like how they're getting to these, why they're moving the way they're moving, why do they throw the pitch they threw there. Like you have to be able to actually pick their brain, get inside their head to understand the context. Like I'll get annoyed when an athlete just sends me a video of like, it'll be like a side view or a back view and like no context. Just
No words, nothing.
like
Yeah,
they
just a
expect me
video.
to be like a wizard that I can just see a video and like instantly tell them what to do. And sometimes there's a glaring issue. Like you can like have a pretty good educated guess of what they need to do. But my response is almost always the same thing. It's like, I need to know like, what were you trying to do? I need to know how the outing went overall. Like, how did you feel? Command. Like, I want to get inside their head. Were you anxious, nervous? Was this a travel day? Were you fatigued? Unless you have the context, unless you know kind of what's going on mentally, it's very difficult to appropriately diagnose what's going on. And so I think our coaches have historically been very good about having those conversations, but again, wasn't a formal process for educating them on like, here's why routines matter. Here's the type of, personality you have on the mound. These other, second and third layer questions to the mental game. Kyle, do you have a story of how you kind of initially came across the mental side?
Yeah, I was just interested in it in high school. I remember reading the original Heads Up Baseball, The Mental Game of Baseball by H.A. Dorfman. I actually developed a relationship with Alan Jaeger when I was in high school, and I was really, really interested in that aspect. And as I got to college to play, I took all of my training into my own hands and just fell in love with the prospect or the process of physical training. And I think it was because having that control, I knew I could control all of that. And then when the physical attributes ended up not being the limiting factor anymore, I think what happened with me is I actually almost educated myself too much in the mental side, and that traditional mental skills actually started to harm me because when doubt came into play, I would overthink things and I would go back to that well completely all the time, just going back to trying not to ruminate, which would make me ruminate more. And it almost hindered me in a sense because I knew too much and I would think about it too much. And once I was removed from the game of baseball, I really got into the idea of mindfulness and kind of knowing like, all right, I need to understand myself more. And then I need to be able to recognize when these emotions are happening, when this anxiety is happening, when the stress is happening, and then refocus. Instead of focusing on trying to fix that problem, focus on the task at hand. So I think having those tools too early and not having context, not having an adult that I trusted to talk about it, actually led to me later on in college developing the yips as a catcher and not being able to throw the ball back. And I would go back to the well of trying to figure out why is this happening? Why is this happening? Instead of just figuring out, all right, this did happen. How do I get past it and focus on the task relevant side? And I think that's why I became so passionate about the mindfulness stuff, is because I think there's a place where the traditional mental skills got us to, and then I think the mindfulness component and training the right way can get us past those. And I think I was stuck in that loop in the middle where the rumination just kind of harmed me when it actually became my limiting factor, when early on in my career was probably the thing that helped me get to the point where I learned to control the controllables. And then when I figured out I couldn't control everything, I had nothing else to fall back on.
Can you explain the difference between what we're referring to as traditional mental skills versus the more mindfulness approach for those who maybe aren't familiar with that?
Yeah, so like the traditional mental skills would be when you have self-doubt or negative self-talk, you try to stop that. You try to stop those negative emotions. Or if a situation feels too big for you, you try to control that situation and forget about it. And that can lead to a little bit of rumination for some people, especially those people that are more prone to having issues with the mental side of game. Where the mindfulness comes into play is basically just releasing those and recognizing those thoughts without judgment. Instead of trying to override them, you basically tell yourself, all right, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now. I know that I have to get back to this one focus, which is, if you're pitching, it's just throwing this pitch to the best of my ability. It's not trying to block everything out. It's basically recognizing everything, moving past it with judgment, and making it more of a process-based approach to it, not an outcomes based. And like Alex said earlier, it's not if, it's when. When is that going to happen? So if you look at people like, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, it's not that they were, or even Derek Jeter, it's not that they elevated their game in those stressful situations. Those stressful situations didn't get too big for them like they may have for other people. They played the same. They were able to play at the same level with their skill set, in game 7 of the regular season and game 7 in the finals or the World Series, where the other athletes, that when started to happening, those other high level athletes were able to use the stress, the environment, to actually keep themselves steady at that same level of play.
So maybe a concrete example of this, just to like, for people who are trying to see, like, how does this apply to me? Okay, maybe you're pitching a game, you walk like the first 2 batters, right? You can either, and you have this negative thought creep in, like, oh my gosh, shit, like, what happened? Like, what did I just do? Is coach going to pull me? Like, you have these negative thoughts start to happen. Traditional approach might be focus on, okay, I just had that negative thought. I'm going to try to eradicate. I'm like, don't think about this. Like, eradicate, control these negative thoughts. Mindfulness is like, okay, the first step is the same. I'm aware now of the fact that I just thought, oh crap, what happened? Like, I'm aware of the negative thoughts, but allowing it to just exist judgment-free, pass right on through you, and then just bring your focus back to the present, back to the task. What do I have to do next pitch? Refocus on the next pitch, as opposed to try to eliminate and control. And you mentioned the word rumination, but just like hyper fixating and like not being able to move on from those negative thoughts.
It's understanding that emotions and feelings are fleeting and being okay with that. Like, this feeling came into me, this feeling of self-doubt, this negative thought, and not being like, oh no, don't throw a ball, don't throw a ball. Oh, that's a bad thought. I have to think, throw a strike. You've just taken 3 or 4 steps. So being mindful is removing those steps to go from basically point A to point B just a little bit faster. And it is a process, and if you have difficulty with that process, you might not be able to go pitch to pitch and have task relevant focus. And that's okay. That's where you're at in this moment. So your goal then is to be able to go pitch to pitch, and then it's to go batter to batter, and then it's to go inning to inning, and then game to game. So you have those lapses less often. And if you can go about that and understand it's process oriented and not outcomes oriented, that I have to have this process of task relevant focus, one pitch at a time, and you're able to do that pitch to pitch, and then maybe you lose it for a batter, pitch to pitch, lose it for a batter. Eventually you're understanding, all right, this inning, I want to try to do it for 2 consecutive batters. I want to try to do it for 3 consecutive batters. I want to try to have that task relevant focus for the entire inning. And you build on that process. That's how you build that mindful muscle. Just like you would with trying to increase your squat, just like you would with doing a throwing program to increase velocity.
I think this brings up a good point, which is that, the process you described, somebody watching this who has the yips, somebody watching this who has major command issues, right, they're going to instantly see the value in what you're talking about and being able to stay focused. Somebody who doesn't have command issues, right, they maybe already clicked on to the next video because they like, oh, this isn't me, this is whatever. It's like, this isn't relevant to me. I have no issues, and they're going to wait until like they do have that struggle to try to look into it a little bit more. Obviously, that's one misconception. That's one myth out there, is like it's only for like the weak-minded people that like need mental skill stuff. But what are maybe some other misconceptions that you guys have seen, or other myths associated with mental training that people?
I would offer to anybody watching this who's like, oh no, that mental stuff, that's not for me. Like, the mental side of any athletic event doesn't become a problem until it becomes a problem. Same thing with mobility, same thing with strength. Again, like, you can take for granted a lot of these functional components of your training, program, and think that, oh, I only need the throwing piece, you know what I mean? Or, oh, all I need to do is improve my pitch design or whatever. And like, that might be your immediate priority right now, but like any well-rounded team, any well-rounded program is going to make sure that all of your bases are covered, right? So like, the goal of this is not necessarily to like make everyone a mental skills expert. Like, every athlete is different. Some guys need a lot more mobility work and some guys need a lot more strength work. Like, every athlete is different and requires different amounts of this. But to outright neglect this component of your athletic development, I think is setting you up. It's a risk, right? And it's a risk reward ratio of like, how much are you potentially risking if you get to this? Whereas how much are you benefiting by you're just making sure that you're exposing yourself to these things? They don't have to become the mainstay, but like I said, you don't want it to become a problem and then you're just completely not equipped to handle it. Like, you want to make sure you have the tools and you have the resources so that if you do start to struggle again, you can quickly fix that problem and not allow it to become a much larger problem than it otherwise needs to be.
I mean, he nailed it. If you don't have the tools to fix the problem and the problem becomes an issue, then you're going to be completely lost. That's when it's going to become a bigger issue. There's going to be exponential problems. So having the foundation, or at least knowing where to go for the information, having the resources, being able to find those and having the tools to be like, all right, hey, this is starting to become a problem for me. How can I address that? That's the first piece. And then the second piece is actually having the foundational training tools that you've started so you can be like, all right, I know what I need to do to get past this problem. I've already started to train a little bit. What are the next steps? And I think the mental skills piece is not just important for your skill or for your sport, but I think this is a piece just like anything else, developing strength, developing endurance, developing speed. Those are all things that can help you later in life. But the mental side of it is going to help you in every aspect of your life. If you understand how to develop mental skills, mental toughness, how to get past failure, obstacles, it's going to help you in, personal relationships. It's going to help you emotionally. It's going to help you in your career. So I just think that it's a tool that everybody needs, especially in the game of baseball. When you're a pitcher and you're very lonely on the mound, if you're a hitter and you're constantly dealing with failure, you've got to have some kind of resource or avenue to understand how to deal with those emotions, get past those emotions, and then get yourself to the point where you can do the thing that you love to do, which is play baseball, pitch to pitch to pitch.
Well, I just want to add one more thing too, that like, everybody looks back on their athletic career with 20/20 hindsight. Each one of us looks back on our own athletic career and however it panned out, for the better, for the worse, and thinks, I wish I would have known then what I know now. And that's why you hedge your bets. That's why every athlete out there is doing some strength, some mobility, some nutrition. Like, you don't know exactly what contribution each of these components are going to add up to your overall development, but you make sure that you're well-rounded across the board because you're trying to minimize in advance the amount that you'll look back and be like, oh, I wish I would have done that different. But again, the vast majority of guys, like, they know mental skills is relevant, they know it's important, but it's just outright not a part of their program at all. So again, like, you don't want to look back with 20/20 hindsight in your career and think, what if I would have been better prepared mentally to deal with failure, to deal with that bad outing, to deal with confidence issues? Because for the same reason, you don't want to look back on your career and be like, man, I wish I would have been in the gym more. Like, you don't want that regret, right? So be proactive with your own career and hedge your bets across the board.
Well, I think the great thing about this course is that there is still stigma, as you mentioned earlier, especially for high school kids. And this might not be something that they want to do or see a lot of people having them do, but the way we've developed the course, this is something that they can do on their own every single day in 5 to 10 minutes. And nobody even needs to know about it. So they're building their mental skills, they're building mental toughness, they're building the ability to focus on the relevant task at hand, whether it's pitching, hitting, or schoolwork, and they're able to train in the comfort of their own home and do it without anybody knowing. And we also built it so coaches can implement it very, very easily. It's very simple for coaches to take this routine, this curriculum, this information, and put it at the beginning of a practice for 10 or 15 minutes, 5 days a week. You're usually limited with your space, especially in the winter in northern states when you're practicing. You might have to be inside. You might have to share those resources with the JV team, the softball team, the basketball team. If you show up 15 minutes early, you can get this mental skills training done prior to anything that you're doing that's involved in physical type skill work.
I think another misconception to add on top of that is some players just see like, the Friday night starter on their college team, or they look at big leaguers, or they look at like the star guy in their high school league or whatever it may be. And like, there's different phrases you might use for that guy. Like, that guy's a competitor. Like, that guy has that dog in him. Like, that guy can turn on when the pressure's on. and they just think like some guys have it, some guys don't. Like I'm never going to get to that level. And there can sometimes be a myth this isn't as trainable as the reality actually is. But I think if you break down like what does that actually mean? Like he has that dog in him. What does that, if you actually like peel back the layers of the onion, it's like, well, it means that like when adversity hits, when something bad happens, he can refocus. It means that when there's normally 100 fans and now there's 10,000 fans, it doesn't rattle him. He's able to refocus on the task at hand, the task relevant focus. So if you actually break down, like we put all these like this terminology behind like these guys that just like have it, but it's really just like maybe they didn't have to practice as much to be able to acquire some of these skills, the ability to refocus, the ability to not get rattled, to perform under pressure. And some other people have to spend a lot more effort to get to that same point. But it's been proven time and time again. There's so much research on mental training works. Like you can improve. Maybe the guy who maybe you can't get to, like you're not going to be at Kobe Bryant's level maybe in 3 months, but it doesn't mean that you can't improve from where you are at this point. So looking at the guys that are just so good under pressure, they're better in clutch situations. What is really happening there? It's that, again, they don't let the situation get too big, and they maybe innately in some cases, if they didn't happen to work on it, are able to follow these basic skills. But again, it's the same exact fundamentals that you're working on in your actual mental practice. Because I initially, when I like first, I knew about what meditation was, like been exposed to some basics, like in, yoga classes, whatever, like things in high school. But it kind of seemed abstract to me. It was like, you're just sitting there, you're not doing anything. Like, what's the point? I'd rather go do another set of squats or something. I'd rather go like long toss. Like that's so tangible, and you can see and measure the improvement. But I kind of didn't realize how important it was until I struggled in college, especially as a freshman, and started to actually, I was searching. I was like, what can I do to actually like not get cut from this team? Like my delivery's all a mess, my mechanics are a mess. Like I feel like I have no idea what I'm doing there on the mound. Luckily enough, had a pitching coach who like maybe didn't address the mechanical side with me as much as I would have wanted, but really understood the mental side. And so it gave me something to latch onto and really buy into. And it was at that point that I realized, okay, the meditation stuff, like it actually does work, and this is why, because it gives you the ability to refocus, to have a routine, to use your breathing, and to be able to focus on the task at hand. And so for someone who like, my mechanics were all over the place, but I could at least know I had that one anchor when I went out there, is I could stick to my routine, my process, my breathing, and still find a way to compete, still find a way to get guys out, even though I was throwing 86 at the time. Like I was probably the worst player on the team. It gave me something that I could actually like buy into and latch onto.
Well, there's a huge physiological component that's rooted in evolution. So as humans, we see stress and we see obstacles, and we have a catecholamine response where adrenaline, epinephrine, and norepinephrine are released into the body. And if you perceive that obstacle as a threat, it's very hard to turn the noise off that's around you and focus on what you need to focus on. If you perceive that obstacle as an opportunity, then you can usually figure out how to get back to that task relevant focus. And mental skills is basically providing you with the ability to recognize and be self-aware enough to realize, all right, I'm having this physiological response where I feel nervous, I have the butterflies in my stomach, my heart's racing, and either understand that I can harness that, like a guy like Max Scherzer, that's just, he's just a competitor, to use the term you used. He's going to harness that, and that's going to drive his focus more. And then a guy like Corey Kluber that is a little bit more Zen-like, he's probably able to feel when that speeds up, and he's able to use some kind of routine, as you mentioned, to calm himself down so he can get back to that task relevant focus. And that's what mental skills does, is it allows us to develop self-awareness so we know, hopefully, hey, I perform better when I'm amped, or I perform better when I'm a little bit more chill. And it allows us to recognize also in the moment, I'm getting out of that zone. How do I get back into that zone so I can focus on this and block out my mom, my dad, my coach screaming at me, the shortstop that made the error, the scout that's here, the 70,000 fans that are screaming, and get back to that one focus that we need to have to perform to the best of our abilities.
I like that you brought that up, and that's a great segue into the next point, which is that our big struggle in coming up with this curriculum and how we wanted to lay out the course was like, we know that there are some fundamental principles that everyone's gonna be following, but we also know that we're all individuals. We all have very unique differences, different personalities. So again, that was one of the things we really grappled with. How do we incorporate some individuality here, where it's not just like telling people like, here's the process, here's how you like do mental skills perfectly. It's like, no, everyone's going to be different. Seeing very obvious examples, like Scherzer's going to have a different persona on the mound as Corey Kluber, as a Clayton Kershaw, as a Blake Snell. Like they all have their own unique personality. So how do we capture that? How do we train that? Do we train that? Do we just be aware of it? Do we try to change people to be a certain type? Alex, I know you were kind of foundational in figuring out how we might assess that and then guide people based on their own responses, but maybe speak to, the eyes off the palms, like some of these different ideas we had early on.
Yeah, so again, I think that like we all know that every athlete is a little bit different. To your point, we've already brought up Scherzer and Kluber as examples of guys who just like their demeanor is different. And so I think the first step in kind of addressing the differences and the nuances between athletes is just like identification, right? I think a lot of athletes, I know I sure didn't, a lot of athletes don't ever ask themselves the hard questions of like, hey, like, how do I really best perform? You have a general idea of like, hey, I feel like I've had my best outings when I'm really amped up, or I feel like I'm more of a calm guy. Like you kind of have a general framework, but like most athletes, and to include myself in college, like don't go much beyond that. And so the first step was to like ask some pretty important and some pretty tough questions that a lot of athletes may never really take the time to ask themselves just because they don't really know. There was previous research that had already been done in team settings using different questionnaires. The general idea is you ask an athlete following like one of their best outings, like ask them to answer 10 or 15 questions, right? And there's standardized models and stuff like that. And then you can start to draw conclusions over time with, hey, you report that you're generally feeling this type of way when you play your best. Conversely, you generally self-report that you feel this type of way when you perform your worst, right? Like these conclusions that most athletes are probably reasonably self-aware of, but it adds a lot more clarity to that. So like we took some of these pre-existing questionnaires all under the idea that there is no one optimal state of performance psychology across the board, right? You're going to look a little bit different than you will, than I will, and the point is not to make an athlete be one type of way. The point is to help an athlete self-identify, this is my one type of way, right? To figure out like what your actual kind of like flow state feels like and looks like to you. And then once you identify that, then you can get to that state much more regularly. So again, I think that like from the performance psychology piece, the real goal was to ask the right questions that will help an athlete just arrive at a much more clear understanding of like, hey, I actually do pitch way better when I'm much more aggressive, right? Maybe you've always known that, but you've never taken the time to reflect on that. Now that you know that, can you get better at the tools to get you more aggressive if you find you're a little bit flat? Or conversely, again, maybe now after being asked the questions that we came up with, an athlete realizes for the first time, like, hey, now I understand that I need to be calm and I need to be relaxed in order to play my best. Like I kind of knew that, but I never really reflected on it. Okay, great. So now knowing that, can you be provided with and can you improve the tools that if you find yourself getting a little bit too amped up or a little bit too aggressive or too kind of, jittery, can you have the ability to self-regulate and bring yourself back down? Like that's what we do with the warm-up too. Like every pitcher has to have their body feeling a certain type of way. It's the same thought process from the mental side as well. Figuring out what is your optimal state and then giving you the tools to get to that optimal state should you find that you're a little bit left or right of center.
I think what makes so much sense there is that we're not telling them what they have to be.
Right.
We're giving them the tools to figure out what they are.
Yep.
And then saying, okay, you just told me that, we just found out, okay, you pitch better when you're calm, you pitch better when you're loose, you pitch better when you're, following a very structured routine and you know exactly what your game plan is ahead of time. Like you're telling me all these things, these are your results. Based on this, here are tools and tips for each one of these to make sure you can get back into that state every time. So like caffeine intake would be a very obvious one for guys who pitch better amped up versus a little bit calmer. It's like, if I feel myself getting too amped up, like what are some tools you can do? Well, let's restrict caffeine intake pregame in maybe those night games where you feel that happening, or big crowds where you feel that happening. Let's restrict caffeine intake. Let's be able to focus on some of the slow breathing techniques. Maybe you do a calming meditation type exercise in the pregame routine or in your bullpen routine. Like we give a number of tools for each single one. So it's like, here's what you're telling me you are. Here's where you are. I'm not telling you what you are. But given that response, here's a set of tools that you can begin to implement. But this isn't like a quick fix, one and done type thing. This is like the start of the training process. This is just giving them the starting point. There's always going to be a trial and error piece to this. So it's going to be the athletes that buy in, they take this, and this is the jumping off point to start actually having a mental training practice and some awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of self-exploration that has to happen from any sort of mental development. In other components of training, I think most guys would probably agree stronger is better. Most guys would probably agree being more flexible is probably better. Like there are some other fundamental truths that are probably a little bit more commonly agreed upon. But in the mental skills piece, you can't necessarily say, or at least I don't think that you should necessarily outright across the board, you need to be aggressive to pitch hard. You know what I mean? You need to be calm, right? That's very context dependent. That's very different between athletes, right? So again, there's going to be any athletes who do kind of buy into this and bite off a little bit of this, have to be willing to explore a little bit. And then again, that's the goal, is to figure out, hey, who am I as a pitcher, right? And what are the things that I need to do in order to get to the best possible state? And then ask those questions, identify that for yourself. And then once you pin that down, that's the first step that a lot of guys never do in their career. I know I didn't. Never once did I really get down to the nitty gritty and self-reflect on who am I when I'm at my best and who am I when I'm at my worst? And if you never ask that question, how are you ever going to develop a program to get you there, right? You have to know where you're going in order to build a path to get you there.
So I'm just going to go through a couple of these different dimensions that we came up with, and if you guys want to jump in and like give, a take on maybe a tip on each one, or pick one of those. So structured and adaptable, right? That's one dimension that we came up with, where you get graded on amped up versus calm, loose versus tense, carefree versus serious, and then aggressive versus relaxed. And then we also have this other dimension of just ranking them on levels of mindfulness. So how aware are you, just in general, of like what your body, your feelings, like your emotions, like what's your internal awareness level? To your point on like more is not always better. Even mindfulness, you would think like more mindfulness always better, but like there's definitely guys where they get too stuck in their own head, where they're like hyper aware of their mechanics and they're only focusing on what their like mechanics feel like, not on actually competing. So I think for all of these, again, there's probably a sweet spot for each guy. But do you have any takes on any of those dimensions in particular?
I think the first one you talked up, structured versus adaptable, that sticks out to me. That like, are you the type of guy who you have a perfect pregame routine, and if that routine gets thrown off at all, like all of a sudden all hell breaks loose, right? And if that's who you are, there's nothing wrong with that. That just necessitates that you plan things out maybe a little bit more deliberately and have a plan for a bullpen, or like a rushed bullpen. Like you need to have that thought out. Or again, conversely, if you're the guy who like just needs to throw 5 or 10 pitches and get loose and you're ready to go in the game, nothing's wrong with that either, right? But this is all geared towards like, you need to self-identify who you are, because who you were as an athlete, who you were as an athlete, who I was an athlete, are all going to be different, but it's what's best for us that we need to ask ourselves and really kind of pin that down moving forward.
Let's talk a little bit about routines, because that's a big section that covers 2 different modules in the course. What's the biggest benefit to having a routine, having a set of processes that you can go to, especially when you're talking to, I mean, most pros have some sort of routine, have been introduced to at least the basics of this. Maybe we can like streamline it a little bit and fine tune it, but especially speaking to like high school kids who have no process, they've never even been introduced to this. How might you explain like what are the benefits of a pre-pitch routine, a pre-game routine, an in-game routine, if they're kind of skeptical and they don't really understand why there needs to be this whole emphasis put on routines?
It gives you something to fall back on when nothing's going right. You're going to have those days. High school, your girlfriend's going to break up with you. You're going to flunk a test. Your parents are going to scream at you. You're going to get detention. The bus is going to run out of gas or break down. When you have a routine, when everything is going wrong, you can always fall back to that routine. Even at the higher levels, you're going to have a day where your body doesn't feel good. Maybe your kid's sick. Maybe you ran out of the food that you wanted to eat. Having a set routine that you can do, and sometimes you can't go through that whole routine, but having at least 1, 2, 3 things that you can always fall back on, that you always know are there when you don't feel the best, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional, is extremely important. Humans like to feel like they're in control, and we live in a world where we have very little control over a lot of things. And the game of baseball, a lot of times we don't have a lot of control over a lot of things. So having that one piece that you can control all the time is extremely important. I also think it's important to understand that you don't want to be a slave to your routine, because if something does happen where you can't do your full routine, then that's another stressor that's added on to that day that's already crazy. So maybe having a routine that you would like to do in a perfect world, and then having a set routine that you can do quickly, where you always feel you can get back to the center and get back to where you feel the best for your performance, is probably the way to go.
Yeah, so again, these are all things that we not only explain the benefits, some of the science behind it, but then also give guys exercises, worksheets, coaches. Again, these are worksheets that you can give your entire team and not have to come up with the whole curriculum on your own. but essentially classroom sessions where they can figure out, okay, what is my current routine? What tweaks do I need to make? Pre-game, like, am I just spending way too much time on this one piece? Am I not spending enough time to actually like give myself time to warm up, decompress? Like, am I rushing around? A bullpen routine is a good one. Like, we have not just like your get hot routine. What do you do when you have a full half inning or a full inning to get ready? Like, what do you do when you just get called, you have one batter to get hot, like somebody gets injured in the game, or you need to go in, you have two pitches, right? I know for me, like, I've been there, like, when you don't have that like accelerated get hot routine, as we call it, like, I mean, you just get a huge burst of adrenaline, your heart starts pumping, you're like, oh crap, I'm not ready for this, I'm not ready for this, and you feel so unprepared. And I think you can combat a lot of that anxiety that can happen ahead of time just by having prepared for those situations. Like, okay, here's what I do. I know I'm going to establish my primary pitch, a fastball, you know, 3 fastballs middle, 1 fastball in, 1 fastball out. Okay, I'm going to go out on the mound. I'm going to have 8 pitches further to establish my secondary pitch. Cool. I'm done this before. I've prepared. Like, you just have this comfort knowing that you've prepared, you've been there before and you've prepared for this moment, and you already have some of these routines. Like, no matter what happens, it's like, I don't know, it's like you're an actor. You're like in the middle of a performance or something. Like, no matter what happens, you know you're prepared for that. Like, I don't know, maybe like a comedian doing like crowd work. It's like, you know, like, if there's a heckler, you already have a heckler routine. If like this, if you forget this bit, you know you have this bit ready to go. There's like comfort in knowing that you've prepared for any scenario.
I think being prepared, there's a lot of value in that. I think that like that's what a lot of athletes try to do is be prepared. That's why you practice as much as you do, to be prepared for the game. But I think it's Mike Tyson who's like, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Things are going to get away from you. Like, life, the game is not always going to go your way. And we used to at least tell Marines that you don't rise to the level of your expectations, you fall to the level of your training, right? When things start to get away from you, like, you don't just magically like assume this new level. Some people do. Again, it's not impossible, but more often than not, you by default fall back to the level of your training and what you have done through repetition. And that's why repetition through training is such an important piece of the military, that like when chaos like erupts, you need to have something to fall back on that is like that like repetition that has built you those fundamental habits. So same idea applies in baseball as well, and with pitching, that it's rare, not saying it's impossible, but it's rare to just all of a sudden like rise to some brand new level of unseen potential when things get chaotic. More often than not, you need to fall back, and having those routines to fall back on is what provides the continuity that, again, makes sure that you get out of that 2-out jam and it doesn't become like some crooked number on the scoreboard if you could otherwise prevent it by having those things to bring you back to.
Right. And just to explain, like, we're using routines as like kind of a catch-all. There's a ton of subroutines under here, but like your point, when things just go completely wrong, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, the answer shouldn't be like, I have no idea, I make it up.
Right. If you're asking yourself that question in the game,
Right.
it's already too
We're
late.
calling, like, we call that is the red light routine, which is, again, from Heads Up Baseball. But when you're in red lights, when the game speeds up on you, when you start to freak out, it's like, even in that scenario, we have something we can go to.
Right.
We have, okay, cool, I know I need to get off the mound, I need to find the left field foul pole, top the foul pole, I need to take a deep breath, slow exhale. I tell myself whatever mantra I have it written on the inside of my hat, take it off, put my hat on, turn around, refocus, get to work.
And think about how much of your life too you spend, how much of your athletic career you spend not in a game, right? The amount that you get to play in a game is a very limited percentage of like your overall training. So if you don't have that routine because, like, you know, it's 7th inning and all of a sudden something happened and like I need to reset, how much other time is available that you just need to take the time to come up with that routine, right? There's no formula across the board. It's going to look different to everyone, but I don't think there's a good excuse for a talented athlete who wants to take control of their career to not have that routine. It's better to have it and not need it than the other way around, right? And with so much time spent off the field that you can start to ask yourself these questions and develop these things, what good excuse do you have not to have that in your back pocket?
Switching gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about kind of the theory. We've started talking a little bit about like the training process, but when you think of the actual training piece of it, there's so many different tools available. There's different meditation type techniques, there's body scans, progressive muscle relaxation, there's guided breathing, you know, there's more visualizations, imagery, right? As we were researching for this course, again, compiling our own personal experiences, our own coaching experiences, but also just going out, looking at research, again, we came across so many different techniques, and we were like, how do we, this needs to be super practical, super applicable. Like, guys are getting, like, realistically, we're going to get 5 to 15 minutes a day out of people. We might only get that 3 days a week out of people in season only. Like, that's okay, but we need to figure out how do we make this as like practical as possible, and how do we ease people into the more advanced techniques. So Kyle, I know you were kind of foundational in initially laying out what that curriculum, what that progression looked like. Can you maybe speak to why was mindfulness like that first building block, and then how do we build off of that over that full month-long progression?
I think we've talked about like the pitcher personality profile, knowing if we want to be aggressive, if we want to be calm, all of that. To be able to do that, you have to have a certain self-awareness. And that comes through what's called a catch-all term, mindfulness training. Mindfulness isn't some Zen, you know, yoga-based, just basic meditation idea. Mindfulness is knowing that what you have to do to be in that present moment in time, which is what we want. We want to be able to perform on the task relevant focus, which is one pitch at a time for a pitcher. So the next step then was understanding that building mindfulness is just like building a muscle. Like if you want to squat 700 pounds, you can't just get under the bar and squat 700 pounds. You have to have a foundational level of mindfulness, of self-awareness, of the ability to get in the present in a situation that's very controllable. The first step in that is understanding what an anchor is. An anchor is something you can fall back on when things are getting out of control. When you're having that physiological effect within the body, where the adrenaline's pumping, where you're not be able to focus because there's so many things coming at you, where things are speeding up, the red light. So we use the breath as that anchor because it's the easiest thing to understand as an anchor. The breath is something everybody has to breathe to live. In our hyper fast-paced world where we're constantly having information, we're constantly switching gears, we're multitasking way more than we ever had in societies, in the history of society. A lot of people don't even breathe the right way. So we started our first level just teaching people how to breathe, different ways to breathe. What's comfortable for you to breathe? Is it deep belly breathing? Is it breathing more through your chest? Is it breathing in through your nose, out through your mouth? So the first step of that was having some exercises where you're learning how to breathe. You're getting comfortable to breathe. The next step of that was something that was like a guided meditation. And then we moved on to progressive muscle relaxation, where we're having to switch scenes in the body. Because that's basically what you have to do in the heat of the moment. You've got to be able to switch scenes quickly. You have to be mindful and self-aware and present enough that you're understanding the situation's getting bigger. I'm losing focus on what I need to focus on. How do I switch that scene from these negative thoughts in my head back to what I need to do right now, which is throw this pitch in this moment in time to the best of my abilities. So we tried to lay that foundation with the breathing. We tried to teach people a guided meditation so when their mind did start to wander a little bit and lose focus, that we would bring them back. Then we purposely progressed it to the progressive muscle relaxation where they have to switch from one portion of the body to another quickly. And we just continued to build on that until we got to what our skill focus is, which is pitching. And then we use the research on mental visualization and mental training with visualization to build routines on how to actually incorporate our skill into that mental training process.
I think there's a misconception with people in that meditation is like some like weird Zen Far East type thing, and
When there's nothing wrong with that, that can be very beneficial.
there's just like connotations associated with like that word, even mindfulness now because it's been used more and more. Like there's people have connotations, but really it's just like training that focuses on getting present, and it's refocus training essentially. Like it's not as much like no matter how long you do meditation for or mental training for, like you're always going to get distracted. Now it's not like don't get distracted. It's when you get distracted, how fast can you bring your attention back to the present, back to the whatever the anchor is, your breathing in the case of meditation. So I think if people need to more generalize this of like this is just like being present training. Like that's all we're really talking about, and then it's like super easy to see how this corresponds to pitching.
And then learning how to control your breath. You know, are you somebody that needs to be amped up? There's certain techniques we can use to amp ourselves up through breathing. If you're somebody that needs to be calm, there's certain techniques we can use that can help us refocus and control the adrenaline that we're feeling in that moment.
Alex,
do you have anything to add on the general progression that we laid out there?
No, I think the only thing I would add is that the goal of all of this is to be able to, improve your in-game performance, right? That's what all of this is geared towards, like in all of a training. That's why you lift, that's why you throw, it's to be able to perform in-game. But that's a difficult thing to do. And so especially from the mental skills, you're not just going to magically have that ability overnight. It takes time like anything else. And so the way the curriculum was built out in levels and kind of progressively adding things, it's like any other training curriculum, like start small. Right? You have to crawl before you can walk. You have to walk before you can run. You have to run before you can sprint. So like you have to just be able to like breathe, right? Once you get better at that, then maybe you can like meditate a little bit through a guided meditation. Then maybe you can do it a little bit more on your own. And so the way that this has all been built out is not to immediately throw an athlete into the deep end and set them up for failure by like, hey, let's take you from 0 to 60, but let's just add a couple of these layers on at a time. And that's the way that all of this has been built out, so that it doesn't matter whether you're super well versed in mental skills training or you have no background in it whatsoever. Like this curriculum will like step by step guide you and ultimately better prepare you to be better in game, because that's what this is all for anyways.
Final question. This has been great, but I want to know, how do we create buy-in as coaches? Right? I'm sure there's athletes and coaches watching this. Coaches obviously typically know mental training is important. They maybe haven't taken that leap to actually implement it with their team, or they have, didn't get buy-in, kind of backed off, don't do it. Right? That's probably most coaches are either not doing it or dip their toes in and then backed off and still aren't really emphasizing it. What's like 1 or 2 tips that you guys can give them to be able to create that buy-in with their teams?
It has to be important to the coach, and they have to do it consistently. It's like the metaphor I used earlier. They have to put that penny in the penny bank every single day. If the athlete doesn't think it's important to the coach, the athlete will not buy in. The coach has to show that it's important. The coach has to be consistent with the training, do it every single practice, or have a routine where, hey, every Monday and Wednesday and Friday we do this, and then I want you guys to do this on the weekend, and somehow keep track of it. And the other thing, I mean, the coach has to be passionate about it as well. So if the coach doesn't make it a priority, the athletes will not make it a priority. If I want to have an extremely clean kitchen at my house, but I put my work bag in the middle of my kitchen every single day, my kids are going to do the same. So I have to be the example. I have to be the leader. So if the coach can show them with some passion and some excitement that this is important, and they make it a priority in their practice and their training and their development of not just each individual athlete, but their whole team, eventually the players will have buy-in. And this doesn't happen overnight like anything else. I mean, you cannot expect for this to have buy-in probably within 1 season with your athletes. It's going to have to be something that you stick to and you make a priority for multiple seasons throughout the building of your program.
A good example of this is, and we use this example in the course, is Phil Jackson, Hall of Fame NBA coach, and known for incorporating mindfulness and mental training techniques in, with all of his teams. And again, like, he leads by example. He's actually like leading them physically through these meditations, setting aside that 15, 20, 30 minutes, whatever it is, each day to work on this. And so I think that's a big piece of it. I think the education piece is probably a big piece of it too. And that's really the purpose of this course. We built it for our athletes just so that they had this education piece, but obviously other coaches can use this with their athletes too. For me, I think there's also a piece of like, that's all great. Like, you're going to get like some nibbles from the team, but once they actually feel the clarity, like especially like coming out of the first meditation they've ever done, and they're like, and you just ask them like, what do you feel like in this moment? Or our meditations will ask them that question, like take stock of how you feel right now compared to 10 minutes ago. I mean, once they feel it for themselves, like, oh crap, like I am like really clear right now. I have like no anxiety. Like, okay, how would you pitch right now with this clarity? I would probably pitch pretty well. And once they start to apply it for a couple outings, they have some success. Like, again, it's not going to be the entire team, but once a guy has that first taste of success by implementing a method, again, it could be a lifting protocol, it could be a nutrition protocol. He finally gains weight and he's like, okay, I'm bought in now. This works. Mm-hmm. I think that's when you really get the true buy-in, and like the team can start to police themselves a little bit more, especially if like some juniors, some seniors see those results themselves. They can start to kind of spread the word to the rest of the team.
I think from a coaching perspective, to me at least, what stands out is being able to explain the why behind why you're doing all this in the first place. And you bring up Phil Jackson, that's an excellent example. I mean, you've got Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman on the court, like elite level athletes at the world stage. And if they were just told to do mindfulness training and they had no idea what the benefits were or why they were doing it, I bet Phil Jackson would have lost those 3 just as quickly as a high school or a college coach will lose his entire team if he doesn't explain the why behind it, I believe the majority of anybody who's in coaching wants to make sure that other athletes have a better experience and a better career than they did, right? That's why a lot of us get into coaching in the first place. And so why would you leave any stone unturned? I'll go back to, again, like, you might not think preventative maintenance on your truck and changing your oil is a problem. Well, it doesn't become one until all of a sudden, like, it really becomes a problem. And so we want to make sure as coaches that you are preventatively and proactively giving athletes the tools to make sure that they leave no stone unturned in their career. And so by explaining that, I think will help to alleviate a lot of the stigma. It's like, oh, that mental skill stuff, that's only for people who are kind of weird. Like, no. These are some of the things and techniques that the best athletes in the world do. And again, if Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Derek Jeter, all these guys we've mentioned earlier, if they can find value in adding it into their own personal training program, I think it's fair to say across the board, we all can find value out of adding this. It just takes a penny in the jar. It takes a little bit every day. But the why behind it is so important, I think, for a coach to communicate to their players.
Awesome. I think we'll end there. That was a good point to end on, but appreciate you guys obviously helping lay out the program. Been super foundational in that, and excited to see people start to get value out of this thing. So thanks a lot, guys.
Absolutely. No problem.